Hello, students. As we begin the third unit and we read Marjorie Satrapi's The Complete Persepolis, we will also need to start thinking about your next essay, Essay 3. So this video is a comment or two about Essay 3 and what to think about, and then also about how to write that essay because of the features of a graphic novel, how that might affect the way you approach your essay. So first, let's look at what Essay 3 is asking you to do. Essay 3, unlike your first two essays, is not going to ask you to come up with a definitive thesis statement with an argumentative interpretation, but rather to present a good question to ask about this novel and to explain why it's a good question. A good question needs at least two possible answers that are at least plausible as interpretations of the story, and they kind of fit partially. And ultimately, the considering multiple aspects of the question helps us to penetrate the surface level of the novel and get to the more depth level of analysis. When you watch the video lesson for this week, Wallowing in Complexity, I'll say much more about this and why it's an important and good skill to practice. But what I want to highlight here is that your essay is going to be centered on setting up a good question and exploring two different possible answers to that question. And to do those two possible answers, you're going to need to do very quick, concise, close readings of a few key moments in the novel. And so just like any other novel, you can analyze what's being said in the story because graphic novels have speech bubbles. And so you can quote characters when they say something, and you can quote the narrator in these narrator banners. But you can also, and you should also, employ analysis on the level of the visual information, the graphic level of this work. So this is not obviously just a verbal work, it's also a visual work, and you are allowed, and I would expect and hope that you would take into account the visual elements going on as you close read. So one thing I would recommend is looking at this link, Common Graphic Novel Terms, and this is a great resource for you to start thinking about what is going on in terms of visual information in a graphic, in the graphic art of a novel, a graphic novel like this. There's some terms here to think about how to describe what you're seeing. For example, here's one moment in the graphic novel where the narrator says, the relatives run away, they're refugees, and they live in a really nice house. And she's reflecting, they did have a really nice house. We spent our vacation there a few years earlier. And then the uncle says, the marble alone cost me $100,000. Now, you can see the way that the house is depicted, that it's a simple but very luxurious place. None of the details like, oh, there was a pool. We played by the pool. Our parents were able to suntan by the pool. None of that information is conveyed in the narrator's speech bubble, but that is definitely clear from the visual illustration. So if you were analyzing this panel, you might say, the narrator tells us this, and we can additionally infer from the visual information that it had a pool and they played there as kids. And then what does that mean? Then you can analyze that as part of your close reading. For example, here we can sense in the narrator's language, they did have a really nice house. We spent our vacation there earlier, and we see them playing as young children. We can kind of infer the narrator's down here with her cousins. We get the sense, the tone of nostalgia, of warmth and happiness. The narrator liked this experience. But on the other hand, we see that the narrator also is focalizing on the father. My father wasn't so fond of Molly's husband. He thought he was too materialistic. And then in the next panel, we see their quote-unquote materialistic home. So there's two different levels of things going on here. The narrator's own fondness and warm memories, but the father's own moral judgment of their relatives' materialism. So that information, you need some of the visual, you need the verbal and the visual information working together to convey those kinds of subtexts, right? So as you closely read the graphic novel, describe, you can quote the speech bubbles, but you also want to describe the visual information by giving very simple, basic descriptions of what's graphically being shown in the panel. And you can use the terms, graphic novel terms, to help clarify what you're saying about the visual information. Sometimes the graphic illustration can convey very complex information. Like here's a very important panel at one of the high points of the novel in which there is a protest going on about veils. And Satrapi illustrates this with two different sides of women protesting, and it looks like a kind of symmetry is being created here. Notice how it's kind of balanced between the 4 and the 4 on each side of the panel. And they're each chanting and they each have their arms raised. But there are subtle clues that the author may want us to side with one or to think in a certain way about one side versus the other, maybe slightly favoring the freedom side. And how can you tell? Well, there might be some subtle clues, like why are these women closing their eyes versus these women are opening their eyes? And the different visual expression they have on their faces might give us a sense of their sense of moral focus and courage. But it's subtle and it's up to interpretation. So this is where it can get very interesting, and I encourage you to close read the graphic panels in this way. Okay, with that, I hope that you start to think a little bit about this Essay 3 this week, and as you enjoy the first half of Persepolis. See you soon.